Welcome to another episode of our Rescue and Resistance Learning Centre podcast. Eva, how are you?
Thank you. I'm fine. Thank you. How are you, Jonny?
I'm fantastic, especially given the fact that we have a very, very prestigious guest with us today. We're lucky enough to be joined by Rabbi Dr. Rafael Shuchat, a distinguished scholar with a BA in psychology and MA in Jewish thought from Hebrew University, and a PhD from Bar-Ilan University, where his thesis won the Minister of Education's prize. With over 30 years of experience as a senior faculty member at this university, he is an expert in 18th and 19th century Kabbalah with the interface of Judaism and science, and has made significant contributions to Jewish education. Rabbi Shuchat, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you.
Great to be with you.
Did I miss anything out of your introduction? I only try and do brief introductions, but your CV was so long it was difficult to pick what to put in there.
You did a good job. That's fine.
Excellent. So we usually start these podcasts because whenever I'm speaking to my Israeli friends, I'm always interested to check in, see what the situation's like in Israel at the moment with everything that's going on, and just have a little bit of a chat about what we see happening in front of our eyes. Eva, you first. What's the mood in Israel at the moment? The current development is with Hezbollah in the north. What's the feeling? What's the mood?
So the mood, as you are asking, I think that people think it's very scary. I look around and I don't see people who would like to go to war. And we are going to war in the north. So I don't see that kind of commitment and enthusiasm from friends who would be in the army and their parents, as I saw before from November.
Yeah,
so I think it's a terrified atmosphere right now.
It is a scary proposition given the capabilities of Hezbollah. People say 10 times more powerful militarily than Hamas.
Yes.
So it is a grave situation, but one does wonder, is it inevitable anyway with the ideology of Hamas and Hezbollah? This really was only a matter of time since their mission statement really is the destruction of Israel and all of the population there. So, I suppose we're going to have to confront this problem at some point. And I suppose it's just when, really. Rabbi Shuchat, what's your feeling on what's happening at the moment in Israel?
Well, Israel's been fighting a war on about 7 fronts, really, if you figure it out, between the Hamas in the south, Hezbollah in the north, which has been ongoing since October 7th, really. It's just been on different levels all the time. And we even have Hamas from Syria, some Hamas from Lebanon. We have the Houthis fighting us from Yemen. That's already 5. And in addition to that, you actually have Hamas in the West Bank, which has also been doing things against the state. What the 7th one is at the moment, I can't figure it out, but I'm sure. Oh, and also from Iraq. There's been also.
And Egypt aren't exactly friendly neighbors either, let's face it.
Egypt is in a tight space because on the one hand, they are, they removed the Islamic Brotherhood from the head of the government, and Hamas is part of the Islamic Brotherhood. But they still have a large contingency of Islamic Brotherhood, so they sort of have to keep the place in balance. So that's why they don't want to get too involved in the Hamas issues because of their own internal politics and balancing.
And they also don't want to accept a large number of Palestinians into their country either, do you?
They actually don't want any. They actually made a very large barrier. They made it very high.
Yeah.
What's happening actually de facto on the ground is that there are organizations on the Egyptian side. I'm not exactly sure how this works, but they're willing to smuggle you over the border for $5,000 And many Gazans who have money have been doing that. The ones who don't have money have not been doing that. Unfortunately, in Gaza, they have no place to go because all sides have been closed to them. I'm sure a lot of them would be interested in leaving because who wants to be in a war zone? On the other hand, people have to remember that Israel has been literally playing with silk gloves here because Israel has never pinpointed civilians. And for the amount of bombs that Israel has dropped on houses in Gaza, which is 24,000, with one bomb, you can kill 50,000 people.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. So the fact on the ground, Israel has been very, very careful with what they have been doing. If anything, it's the Hamas who's interested in the numbers of casualties of civilians going up, because that's how they win points on the international arena, as we can see on a daily basis. And most people know where Gaza is.
Yeah, when you listen to some of Hamas's leaders, and I've listened to their representative in Iran, and I've listened to Yahya Sinwar, and it's very clear what they were going for with October the 7th. It was basically a PR stunt, and they were hoping for what has happened, and I think it surpassed their wildest dreams. And they are hoping for the destruction of their own population because they know that this will get them traction in the media, that it will get them global support. So whilst Israel is doing more than any other army in the history of warfare that I've ever studied, they are trying to avoid Palestinian deaths, and the Hamas leadership are actually encouraging. They want the blood of their own people. That's the currency that they have.
Yeah. See, Israel has treated the Hamas as a leadership in Gaza, but they're actually a terrorist organization, which means they're only interested in their own survival and not necessarily survival of any of the civilians. They also confiscated the supplies that were given from the humanitarian aid and sold it to the people after confiscating it, and they made $500 million within a few months over selling it to the people, the humanitarian aid that was given for free from the Europeans, from the Americans, from Israel itself. And this is abhorrent, but it's not talked about. Unfortunately, there are people in the media who are objective, but there are also people who are not, for reasons which, you'd have to ask them, because it's a pretty open and shut. If there was ever a war in the history of mankind, which was black and white, that it had to happen, that Israel would have to defend itself, it's now. And all of a sudden, Israel is the evil one for defending its life. It's a very strange thing.
And the amount of...
It was planned for 2 years.
Is the reason of anti-Semitism, or what do you think is the reason?
I don't actually consider it anti-Semitism. I'll tell you exactly what I mean by this. There's a difference between somebody who doesn't like the Jews and somebody who's using anti-Semitism as a means to an end. I put it this way. The Chinese and the Russians are backing Iran at the moment. I can tell you both the Chinese and the Russians are not anti-Semitic. I'm not saying all Russians are. I'm saying Putin happens not to be. And the Chinese are not necessarily anti-Semitic. But the point is they're backing Iran for political reasons. When somebody backs somebody for political reasons, that's not anti-Semitism. It's using anti-Semitism because they know that the other side is going to be able to sell the cause better as anti-Semitism. The Japanese in the Second World War were not anti-Semitic, but they had to build camps for Jews because the Germans forced them to do it. But they had no clue what the Germans had against the Jews. Couldn't figure it out. So I'm just saying that sometimes anti-Semitism is used as a tool. Now, what do I mean here? You have Jews all over the world. Unfortunately, there's a lot of anti-Semitism which exists in the world today in many of these democratic countries. In my opinion, Iran is using the anti-Semitic card to help the anti-Israel fight, which it's trying to do. So even though people equate anti-Israel with anti-Semitism, they're right, but it's the opposite. Meaning they're using anti-Semitism in order to get the anti-Israel card and not vice versa. That's what's happening. So it's a very strange
Very
collaboration
smart collaboration.
between the certain Muslim groups, and I say very much certain Muslim groups who are anti-Israel, and they know they can always rely upon certain anti-Semitic groups which already exist in Europe and the United States to support their cause if they play also the anti-Semitic ticket.
And I think what they've noticed as well, and why this attack has come now, is that they've probably noticed just the huge levels of stupidity in the West as well, in terms of the narratives that are being fed to students in what are supposed to be the most prestigious universities in America. This kind of neo-colonialism, either you're the victim or you're the victimizer, these simple narratives of history. And if you are powerful in any sense, then you must be the oppressors, you must be the bad guys. And they've capitalized on these ridiculous notions that people are using to simplify history and the world today. And they've basically infiltrated the minds of a huge swathes of students in America, and they've made this into essentially a popular movement, a fashion statement where it's cool to go out on these college campuses and protest without really knowing what you're protesting for. And really, when you are there, you're propping up the most extreme form of Islamic fundamentalism. You know, these protesters that are out on college campuses, really, they are pro-Hamas protests. And if these protesters ever went to Gaza while Hamas is in power, or they went to Tehran, the way that they would be treated, the kind of life that they would have there. If any of these protesters, you know, there's 21 countries in the Middle East, where would they want to go and live with their families in the Middle East? Would they want to go and live in Iran? Would they want to go and live in Gaza, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia? Or would they want to go to Tel Aviv and enjoy the beach on Tel Aviv and have these individual freedoms? So it just seems, for me, it just seems so absurd that they've been swept along with supporting the most extreme form of Islamic fundamentalism when these people would just throw most of them off a building.
Yeah, especially when you talk, for instance, about the gay community, which certain elements among it is supporting the Palestinian cause, not knowing that in so-called Palestine, there is no tolerance at all for the gay community. We've had cases here in Jerusalem of Arabs who ran away from their communities because they were gay, and they had to live among the Jews in order to save their own lives.
Yeah,
so I mean, it's just not accepted. The whole concept is
the large majority of the protesters on American campuses, well, the majority are female as well, and then they'll be going out screaming that Israel's an apartheid state. Well, go and have a look at what happens in Gaza. It's an apartheid state, and it's an apartheid between men and women. Women are basically treated like chattel in Gaza with no rights whatsoever.
If you go up and down the state of Israel and see our Arab community, specifically the Muslim Arab community, none of the women cover their faces. But in London, they do. In Toronto, they do. In Paris, they do. It's because Israel has this easygoing atmosphere. It also affects the Muslim community in Israel too, because they don't feel the need to have something to cover your face. But you have certain extremists that seem to flourish in some other countries. And it's strange that in the Middle East, women are not covering their face in many of the countries, but in London and Paris and in Toronto and I don't know what other cities, it seems to be happening. And that's also something which is very strange. I have a colleague here in Jerusalem who's a Palestinian journalist. So he has a YouTube thing where he's being interviewed by somebody, and they said, what do you say to people when they say Israel is an apartheid state? He says, I have friends who say to me that Israel's an apartheid state. So I say to them, well, if Israel's an apartheid state, why don't you go to Lebanon? Why don't you go to Egypt? Why don't you go to Iraq? Why don't you go to Syria? There's so many options. Why do you need to live in an apartheid state? We all know what the answer is.
Yeah, I would. There's so many people in my country, and they just seem to hate this country and the values of this country. And I just wonder, because in my lifetime, I've lived in 5 different countries of my own accord. In my adult lifetime, worked and taught in 5 different countries, including England. So I know if you don't like a country, you can go and live somewhere else. Like because I lived in China, I lived in Japan, I lived in Vietnam, I lived in Poland. If I despise those countries, I'd just leave. If I despise the country that I'm in now, I'd just leave. We live in a very globalized world. Okay, you hate Western liberal democracy, you hate societies that have individual freedoms, you hate democracy. Okay, leave. What are you doing here? Why are you still in this country?
But what are you talking about? Like, who are we talking about right now? These people cannot leave.
Well, in
He's
England, you
talking,
can.
he's talking
In
about
England,
any Arab
yes.
living in Israel.
Yeah,
If Israel per se was an apartheid country, you would think the Arabs would want to leave, but instead they grow by leaps and bounds.
You do not get Arabs leaving Israel, that's for sure. Like, why would they? They don't want to go and live in somewhere where they're just going to be like oppressed and
Exactly.
not have a quality of life.
Right. So by definition, Israel couldn't be an apartheid country because why would anybody want to live here if we were such?
But I mean, even the protesters in England and America, like people, like white middle class people. Okay, so you hate the system, you hate the way of life, you hate our values. Okay, go and live in Iran then. I'm sure there's loads of jobs in Iran at the moment. Go and be a teacher in Iran. I'm sure that go online now, find loads and loads of jobs in Iran. Go there instead. Go to Saudi Arabia. Go to Dubai. There's loads of places that would house you if you wish the destruction of Western liberal democracy and you want to try out a different way of living. Go and leave. I don't know what you're still doing here.
Also, people don't differentiate between a democracy and a dictatorship. In Israel, you can say whatever you want. In Gaza, you can say whatever the Hamas allow you to.
Yeah, well, you see the protests in Israel. You get hundreds of thousands of people protesting the government. There might be a few scuffles, maybe a couple of arrests when people go a bit too far. But imagine the same thing happening in Iran.
I don't think at this point it's hundreds of thousands, but it might have been in the heyday in the middle of, but I think now it's a few thousand.
Yeah, well, it's just an example. Like when Netanyahu was trying to make fundamental changes to the judiciary just before October the 7th, there were massive, massive protests in Israel, and there wasn't, if the same thing. Imagine in Iran, you've got like say 100,000 people out on the streets protesting against the government. The way that they would be treated in comparison to how the Israelis were treated. In Tehran, there would be an absolutely brutal crackdown. But the press as well, are very, very critical of the Israeli government in Israel. There's a free press, there's freedom of protest, and you don't see that anywhere else in the Middle East.
I want to say one other thing that I think that people have not noticed, even though I didn't know that this would be the discussion, but and that is that in this past war, I don't know, for those who remember, a few years ago, we had a war which was called, I think it was Protective Edge, Tzuk, which was one of the numerous operations in Gaza over the years since the Hamas took over in 2006, 2007. In Protective Edge, you had Israeli Arabs who were demonstrating on behalf of what was happening, let's say the Arabs in Gaza, in Tzuk, specifically in the city of Lod. It was even a little bit violent. In this past war, which is already, I've lost the count of the months, but we're definitely at least 7 months into this war, the Israeli, the Arab citizens of Israel have not taken part in the protests. This is a statement by itself. It realizes when Israel is fighting for its life, they're on Israel's side.
Today is the 265th day of the war.
Okay. Yeah.
And the Tzuk, the Operation Protective Edge was in 2014, just to...
Thank you. So my point is that when push comes to shove, and they realize that they have to show their allegiance, all of a sudden they don't demonstrate because they would rather be here. So,
And
yeah.
just like segueing towards the past now, which is obviously all of our specialisms. I'm by training a historian, and of course you are as well. One thing that made us start this series of podcasts was that we were troubled by some of the narratives that we could see happening around us in light of the conflict. And the war is on many, many different levels. And this is something that our joint friend Avi Blumenthal would say. The war is on language, the war is on information. Yeah, Blumenthal, sorry. The war is on, and when we discuss it, it's on many different languages. The war is on information. The war is obviously military. The war is economics, but the war is also language. And you can see these words that are being used very purposefully to try and change people's thinking. And I saw the word, and we were talking a little bit about this. Me and Rabbi Shuchat were talking a bit about this. I saw on banners and signs during protests the word Zionism being used repeatedly, and people are screaming this word out, "Oh, Zionists!" But I would definitely 100% class myself as a Zionist. There are obviously many, many different approaches and many different forms of Zionism, and many different people that would agree with some aspects of a particular strand of Zionism and maybe not others. And we see, perhaps the most obvious example of this would be secular and religious Zionists, but there's many different approaches to this, hundreds of different approaches. It's a very complex term, but it's being simplified and used as a vehicle to really just put all of the anti-Semitic tropes that you can think of just into a word and contain it into this word and make people seem like they're villains, really, and just label them. It's very easy for people, okay, label them a Zionist. And what is a Zionist? Okay, it's kind of some kind of colonial monster, a murderer. Oh, they're Zionists. Okay, so we can do whatever we want to them because they're evil, these Zionists. And people have no idea about the history of this term or indeed what this term actually means today. So we started a podcast series talking to some of our joint friends who are historians, and we started in the 19th century talking about some of the proto-Zionists like Yehuda Alkali, and I've seen a video with you, Rabbi, where you're talking about Abraham Cook, and then we've moved towards the Zionists, which people would be a bit more familiar with, the secular Zionists, most famously Theodor Herzl, and we've been moving towards the Second World War with the history of Zionism in Europe, but also in the land of Israel. And I'm interested to ask you, which figures are you most interested in the history of Zionism? Say 19th century Zionism. Who are the people that you find particularly inspiring and interesting, Rabbi?
Maybe I'll just describe a little bit the rise of Zionism.
Yeah, please
which
do.
happened mostly in Russia and Eastern Europe in the 19th century. Remember, Jews have been out of their land since the year 70 of the Common Era. With the destruction of the Second Temple by Titus. And so Jews were, they still lived in Judea until 132. In 132, there was an attempt to retake Jerusalem. It was called the Bar Kokhba Revolt from 132 to 135. It was put down brutally, basically, by the Romans. And after that, the Romans changed the name of Jerusalem, the Aliyah Capitolina, which means they made it a pagan city, did not allow the Jews to live there anymore. And they changed the name of Judea to Palestine, meaning it wasn't the Jews who were here, it was the Philistines of them, the long gone from the Bible, who were here just to make a point.
So it was they named it Palestina to really antagonize and insult the Jews. It was an insult.
Exactly. After the destruction of the temple, the Romans made a coin in Judea. And in that coin, there was a picture of a Roman legionnaire with a sword and a Jew on his knees. And it said, Judea capta. Judea has been captured, just to make the point. And then, of course, you have the Ark of Triumph, which is in Rome, with a picture of the vessels of the temple on the top of the ark, which are being taken out. You can see the candelabra, you can see the incense altar, and a few other things that are taken out by Roman legionnaires, accompanied by Jewish slaves. So this is what the Jews had to face. There were multiple attempts to take back Jerusalem, by the way, not just the Bar Kokhba revolt, but they all failed. And eventually, the Jewish population moved to Babylonia, which today is the areas of Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Iran today. And that's where the Jewish community basically lived and to a great extent flourished until the 10th century. But Jews always tried to come back to Israel, always tried to come back to Zion. By the way, it had various names because you had various conquerors. If you're talking about colonization, so you had the Babylonians colonized originally after the first temple, Judea, which was the southern kingdom, because the northern kingdom was colonized by the Assyrians in 722 before the Common Era. And Judea was able to survive until 586. And then it was colonized by the Babylonians. And then the Jews also went to Babylonia. And then in the second temple, you have the Greeks, the Seleucid Greeks, and then you have the Romans. Eventually, in the middle, the Hasmoneans are able to get back their sovereignty for about 100 and so years. And this continues. Different colonizers. You had the Mamelukes, and you had the Byzantine for a while, the Crusaders, but most of the time you had Muslim conquerors, especially when we talk about the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. They conquered Jerusalem in the 1500s, and they hold on to Jerusalem till 1917. So they are the colonizer at the time, and then come in the British, 1917. They are the last colonizers of Judea, which included also Transjordan, what the British renamed Palestine. It didn't have that name under the Ottoman Empire. It was erased a long time ago, but the British liked history and they remembered what the Romans did, so we call it Palestine. By the way, the flag of Palestine under the British was a Magen David. People don't realize it's the Star of David. And of course, the British had a mandate from the UN to control this area in order to give it over to the Jews. Because in 1917, Lord Balfour published the Balfour Declaration, which was a royal declaration, basically promising the Jews all of what was called Palestine in 1917. And then, of course, the British government changed its mind and said, okay, a little bit we'll give to Transjordan, a little bit to Jordan, etc., and things like that. And in 1948, you have the first attempt in the history of mankind to do decolonization, where the actual indigenous Jews from Judea from the year 70 are actually coming to their ancestral homeland and starting a state. It's the first attempt in human history to decolonize. So calling that colonization means that people don't even understand what they're talking about. Somebody once said, people don't even understand what colonization is. So when they see decolonization, they think that's colonization. But it's basically Jews coming home.
I think it's worth mentioning Jewish immigration to the land of Israel during the 19th century as well, under the Ottomans. So there was land reform in about the middle of the 19th century, and people started emigrating towards, I think at the start of the 19th century, there was probably a very small amount of Jews, but like you mentioned, there'd been that constant presence. So maybe there's about 10,000. And then some of the proto-Zionists that are referenced before, there's this compulsion, and usually it was driven by persecution, maybe in Damascus, elsewhere in Europe, this compulsion to move back to the ancestral home, and the Ottomans were selling land, so these land purchases began, and then people started in greater numbers. Am I right?
We also have to
moving
remember
back.
that this area under the Ottomans and even under the British was not the most attractive land to have. First of all, there was nothing here. It was desert. If you read Samuel Clemens, whose nickname was Mark Twain, he has an article, he has a little book called Innocents Abroad.
Yeah.
Which is his travels around the world, and he also traveled to the Middle East. When he comes to Palestine, of course, it wasn't called Palestine then because it was still under the Ottomans. He comes in the 1880s. And he describes in his travels, he said, we traveled for 3 days and I couldn't see a person or a house and barely a tree for 3 days.
Yeah.
He says, finally he came to Jerusalem and there was a small town. When he came to Jerusalem, there might have been maybe about 15,000 people living there at the time. By the way, Jerusalem was majority Jewish by 1850. There were 4,000 Jews and 4,000 others, Christians, Muslims, etc. 1850. But in general, Palestine was not a place, what the British are going to call Palestine was not a place to live in under the Peel Commission, which was in the 1930s. They said if 1 million people were to live in British Palestine, the economy would not be able to support them. Now, today we have 10 million people in Israel, and there's about 6 million people in Jordan, maybe even more. So, these things worked out. But I'm just saying, the Peel Commission said there's nothing here. It's desert. How are you supposed to have an economy? How are you supposed to have people? Zionism was the dream that Zion, of course, is the biblical term for Jerusalem. And it was the dream that the Jews could one day come back to their home. It was the type of dream, though, that many Jews weren't sure if it was feasible. In our prayers 3 times a day, we pray that God return us to Zion and take us out of the exile. But in actuality, if you look around the beginning of the 20th century, especially after emancipation in Western Europe, Western European Jews who might have maybe liked the idea didn't think it was practical. In early Zionism, you have almost no Western European Jews. I always say if there's something that Western European Jews agreed upon, whether they were Orthodox or Reform, is that it wasn't practical to go back to Israel. What are you going to do? Build up deserts? Dry out swamps? In the meantime, the Germans, the French, the English, they're nice to us. They're giving us rights, so we should be here.
And that's what had to happen, wasn't it? With the kibbutz systems, people had to go and work the land and drain the swamp and make forms of irrigation.
Right. So where was Zionism popular? In the countries where Jews did not get equal rights. In Russia, in Romania, in areas which are called Poland. It depends at what time, because Poland disappeared as a country for quite a while. And these are places where Jews were said to themselves, like Leon Pinsker, who becomes the director general of what was called the Lovers of Zion movement, Chibat Zion, the early Russian Zionist movement. He says, if we are not receiving emancipation here in Russia, we have to do auto-emancipation. We have to free ourselves. And the only way to emancipate ourselves is by having our own country and by going back to Zion. But this was an idea that didn't catch on that quickly because people were afraid. What are you going to do there? How do you get a job? The Jews who were living there in the 19th century were supported by charity from Jews living in Western Europe, and they were studying the Torah in their academies. And that's the way they were living their lives in dire poverty. So even the Chibat Zion movement, who believed that the Jews should come back, were not exactly sure how to do this in a practical way. They had, in 1884, they had the first meeting in Katowice, in Focșani in Romania in 1882, where the Romanian Jews talked about Zionism and moving back to the land. In 1884, they had their meeting in Katowice, which was an international meeting. What they could show for it was in 1882, what we call the first Aliyah to Israel. where Jews from this Chibat Zion, this Lovers of Zion movement, actually came and set up and created settlements, Petach Tikva and Zichron Yaakov, and also even parts of Jerusalem like Nachalat Shiv'ah and Rishon LeZion. In fact, the first Israeli flag was created in Rishon LeZion. It's still in the museum there, where somebody took a Star of David and stuck it onto a Jewish prayer shawl, what we call a talit, and that was the first flag. And by the way, that was also the flag under the British mandate, just that the British flag was black instead of blue.
And the first Aliyah, since you mentioned that was inspired by pogroms in Russia at the beginning of the 1880s, would you say?
That was part of it, yes, of course. And this was sort of a traditional Jewish Aliyah, not a lot of people. The conditions were very, very difficult. It was literally building something from nothing. Remember, Tel Aviv is sand dunes in 1905. Netanya is sand dunes in 1910. Eilat is sand dunes in 1950. Jerusalem is a tiny city before Teddy Kollek was mayor.
If I can recommend a book here, Thelma Lagerlöf wrote a book called Jerusalem. It's about a pilgrimage in 1882 from Sweden to Jerusalem, and it's a 2-volume book, and it beautifully describes how the circumstances were back then. What Rabbi, you were talking about a few minutes ago, how there was nothing in the country then. How they didn't meet people, and there was a lot of famine and also diseases, and it was very, very hard circumstances right then.
I can give you an example. There was I wrote about the Aliyah of the students of the Vilna Gaon from Belarus and Lithuania from 1806 to 1809. A few hundred.
Was that your PhD thesis?
I'm sorry?
Was that your PhD? That was your PhD thesis?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I didn't just write about the history, I wrote about his ideas. I'm in Jewish philosophy and not in history, which means I'm more interested in ideas and why people think the way they think than what just happened. And in that times from around 1820 till 1860, the plague attacks the Jewish community of the land of Israel 6 times. Cholera about 4 times. There's an earthquake in 1839 in the city of Safed. 4,000 Jews are killed out of the 8,000 who live in the city. Crazy, crazy things. It was very difficult living. You had Jews who were coming from countries where they were not treated well, so they wanted to give it a shot and see what it's like to live in Israel at the time. But it was really, really hard being there. So those who went there had to pay the price of being there. It was not easy at all.
The idea of this podcast was born on the night of Shavuot when I listened to your lecture on Rav Kook's approach on secular Judaism and your approach on secular Judaism's Zionism. Can you please tell us about the findings you talked about in this lecture?
Okay, sure. I mentioned the first Aliyah, which came from the Russian Chibat Zion movement. After that, of course, we have Herzlian Zionism. Theodor Herzl, born in Budapest, but who really spent his life in Austria, was, I always say that he was an assimilated Jew. And I always say that out of the, but I'll get to that, but in 1897, he puts together a conference. It's the Basel Conference. His own movement was because things that he saw in the Dreyfus affair when he was reporting it, how this Alfred Dreyfus was basically libeled and blamed for things that he didn't do just to get him out of, he was an officer in the French army and people didn't like him, whatever. And he was shocked to see that.
It was reported that the crowds were chanting death to Jews as well around the courtroom, and he was just shocked that supposedly the most emancipated place in Europe, that this could happen.
That thing which are happening today again. And
Exactly.
Emile Zola wrote his famous piece, J'accuse, where he basically, tried to bring back common sense into this issue. So Herzl had this idea. He was also somebody who knew how to make connections, and he wanted to get political Zionism going. The Chibat Zion Russian movement was political. It had some applications, but it was the type of traditional Jews who really didn't know how to build a state, had never been in an army, and didn't really know how you put together a parliament and things like that. Herzl had grandiose ideas, and he tried to meet with many leaders around Europe. In 1897, he puts together a conference. He's able to bring many Jewish delegates from around the Jewish world, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. And after the conference, he writes in his diary, in 1897, he says, people don't understand what we did today, but in 50 years, they're going to understand what happened here. It was almost prophetic.
Yeah, it was prophetic. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, that's not the only prophetic thing he said as well. He said something, I think it was in 1904, about the Hungarian Jewish community, that if they don't do something in 40 years' time, the community will suffer a devastating catastrophe, like 40 years, almost exactly before the deportations to Auschwitz.
Now, Herzl dies more or less around the second Aliyah, 1904, 1905. And the second Aliyah is the first Aliyah which came from Herzlian type Zionism. However, it was Aliyah mostly from Russia and the areas of Poland. So this already you have socialism, which is very strong in Russia in the early 20th century, even before the Russian Revolution. Now, the interesting thing about the Jews, as I said, Western Jews were never really interested in Zionism because they had their emancipation and they were fine. Herzl and Max Nordau actually were an exception to the rule. The fact that they were actually more type of Western type of Jews were interested in Zionism. But the early Zionists,
and both of them were Hungarians. Let's just say that. Max Nordau
was Hungarian. Very interesting. I didn't know that. Herzl I knew about.
Yeah, Nordau was originally Nordau Miksa. He was a psychiatrist. He lived in Switzerland, but yes, he was the brain behind Zionism.
So as I was saying, the people who came on this second Aliyah, a lot of them become very instrumental in the future state of Israel. People like David Ben-Gurion, people like Brenner, who becomes one of the ideologues of the labor movement. Aleph Dalet Gordon is another ideologue of the labor movement. Rabbi Kook, who also comes exactly at this time, not necessarily part of Herzlian Zionism. He was actually offered the job of being the rabbi of Yaffo, the city of Jaffa. But it happened at the same time. Now, the interesting thing of the second Aliyah is that these were Jews who came from very religious homes in Russia and Poland. Most of them lived in what we call the Pale of Settlement, where the Jews were allowed to live under the Russian government, so that they lived in small communities, which in Yiddish we call shtepels. They grew up in very religious communities, and they rebelled for whatever reason against the religiosity to varying degrees. And Zionism for them was a way to redefine their Jewish identity after the rebellion, of their own personal rebellion against observance, because they were very Jewish and they wanted to do something to save the Jewish people. Remember, socialism was a redemptive idea, saving the world, whatever. And they were all socialists, but they wanted to move it into a Jewish niche where we're going to redeem the Jews by bringing them back to the land and taking them out of the ghettos of Russia and Europe and teaching them how to be normal people again.
But we also, it's worth mentioning again, like in the beginning of the 1880s, we have the Kishinev pogrom, and we have and that's kind of the most famous pogrom that happened in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. But there were hundreds and hundreds subsequent pogroms as well. It was kind of ongoing.
Yes. But this is the second Aliyah is also like the first is an ideology. And they want to create communities, they want to create communes. Therefore, you have the word kibbutz, which is like commune. And they want it to be cooperative. And this is done, the Ganya, etc., kibbutzim, Kinneret, at that time. Gordon had this idea that Zionism is about working the land because the Jews have forgot what the land was about. We were sort of like souls without a body in the exile, now coming back to the land. We are now redefining the national body of the Jewish people. For him, it was like a mystical concept in his ideas. So when you have here, you have people very strong in their Jewish identity who see Zionism as a revivalist Jewish identity concept. And they're also very young. Gordon was one of the older ones. He was in his 40s. Who were very young people. We're talking about 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, really young people at the time. And young people, you know, they're idealistic and they go out there and they want to do things. It's also true that many of the people, the first and second Aliyah, left because life was not easy. I always say it's always better to have loved and lost than not to have loved at all. It was not an easy life. It was not, these were people, Rabbi Kook, when he's writing about the people of the second Aliyah, who he knew quite well. Some of them he knew before they came on Aliyah to Israel because where he was from in Lithuania, you also had many people who had made their way to Israel, like Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was the famous poet of Israel, who later on in his life made Aliyah to Tel Aviv. And a lot of the Jewish maskilim, the ones who believed in the secular studies, revival of the Jewish and the Yiddish literary language. Some of them were in the same yeshiva as Rabbi Kook, because a lot of them came from religious families, and it was a slow metamorphosis before they changed into what they changed into. So Rabbi Kook writes an article called The Article of the Generation, Mama Ardor, where for Orthodox rabbi, he is writing in defense of the second Aliyah. He's saying it's true. I am very saddened by the fact that they've thrown off observance, but they haven't thrown off observance because they're looking for the good life and materialism. If anything, it's the exact opposite. They've left the material world. They are risking their lives in cases of swamps and malaria and defending the land and working the land when there's absolutely nothing there because of their deep belief that they're doing something for the future of the Jewish people. How can you condemn such people? Even if you have criticized them for certain things, you cannot condemn them because what they're doing is good for the people of Israel. So he's playing like a fine line between the community which he belongs to as an Orthodox rabbi and really understanding what's going on in the minds of the second Aliyah, which you, unfortunately, was one of the few who really understood them. And there were a lot of them who respected him for this, even though they didn't necessarily call him their rabbi. There's even a story that Brenner, who actually grew up in a Lubavitch yeshiva as a child and ran off with Rosh Yeshiva's son to Israel and to be a Zionist, but on the way he spent time in London, where he wrote a journal called Hashachar, the morning, and later on makes his way to a kibbutz. He realizes agriculture is not for him, so in the kibbutz they let him be a teacher and work on his writings. Unfortunately, he's killed by Arabs in Jaffa during a revolt which took place in the early 20th century. But they tell the story when Rabbi Kook came to Jaffa. So Brenner heard that Rabbi Kook was in town. People said, let's go visit him. He says, why should I visit a rabbi? What does he have? And then he heard more about Rabbi Kook. And when Rabbi Kook walked through Jaffa, Brenner started walking after him and putting his feet wherever Rabbi Kook was. Somebody walked over and said, what are you doing? He says, I want to walk in his footsteps. Maybe a little bit will rub off on me too. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of respect for Rabbi Kook because he had a lot of respect for the second Aliyah. And they appreciated that. They wanted somebody who would be their link, if you want, to their past, but at the same time, appreciate what they're doing now. And there's always going to be a certain animosity or fear, but he really was that type of person. Azriel Karlibach was the founder of Israel's Maariv newspaper, who was a student in Rabbi Kook's yeshiva in the beginning of the 20th century. In his academy, what's called Merkaz Harav. And he writes, I would say, not exactly obituary, a little bit biography about Rav Kook, only like 3 pages, in a book that he wrote about personalities of Zionist personalities in the 20th century. And he says this was the most misunderstood rabbi. On the one hand, when he said one time we were walking as Mea Shearim, which was the center of the ultra-Orthodox in Jerusalem, and all of them were spitting in Rabbi Kook. You guys, you're nice to these rebellious Zionists. How dare you come into our area? And then as he was walking by the new part of the city, near Jaffa Street, there were these secularists. Oh, you rabbis in the past. He said, this was Rabbi Kook. He got it from both sides. He had to walk the fine line, and he believed in both sides. But he was a little futuristic for his time, because Jews of the shtetl like to fight. We even have that, unfortunately, in the state of Israel today. We're used to fighting, and sometimes we forget that we have more in common than we have divided.
This is such an exciting topic, and unfortunately, we have to finish very soon in a few minutes. So just to wrap up, I would like to ask you a last question. May I, Jonny? Jonny, is it okay if I ask the last question?
Please
Then what would be what do you think, Rabbi? What is your stand on it? What's the difference now between religious and secular Zionism?
I think that's not the issue today anymore, because I think Israelis are Zionists in general. And I think that to be a Zionist, you have to be connected to your Jewish identity. It doesn't matter if you're religious or traditional or secular, but it has to mean something to you. If being Jewish means something to you, then being in the land of Israel will mean something to you. If being Jewish means nothing to you, then eventually you won't stay here. Because there is a price to pay to live in the land of Israel. It's a land of meaning. There are a lot of good people here, a lot of altruistic people here. It's a land which is trying to combine liberal values together with Jewish traditional values. And as my colleague Micha Goodman wrote in a book that he just published recently called The Eighth Day, meaning October the 8th, he said the vast majority of this country agree on most issues. 80% of this country believes in Jewish values and liberal values and democratic values and want to see and work together. But you have the extremities who want people to decide either or. And they get people mixed up because you don't have to decide either or. The whole idea of fusion, of synthesis, this is what life is, because life is complicated. It's never black and white. People are not religious or secular. Everybody is on a gradation somewhere in the middle. That's just life. And so pretending that people are in categories that don't exist, which they love doing in politics because that's how you get votes, but that's not real life. And I think as an educator, which I am, we have the duty to teach people you don't have to be at the extremities. You don't have to vote for the extremes just because they're louder than the other people. You can pick a road with somebody, hopefully some who represents you. And if there's nobody represent you, say, I'm not going to vote until somebody represents them. Because that's what people want. People don't, in most countries, people don't want the extremities. They want the fusion. They want a Jewish identity. They want the values that Jews helped give the world. There's not for no reason what we call a lot of the liberal values Judeo-Christian values, because these are values that Jews brought to the world. A lot of the values about the sanctity of life, that everybody was created in the image of God. The idea of freedoms, of that individual stands before the laws. It says in the Torah, there is only one law both for the stranger and the one who dwells in the land. So these are biblical ideas which have infused the ideas of democracy from the Magna Carta until today. Liberal ideas. I'm not talking about woke liberalism, which is another issue by itself, but some of the basic values that people see as rational values. A lot of them are based in Jewish ideas. And I think in Israel, most people feel that way too. And this is something we have to educate towards. And because for us, education and the belief for the righteousness of our cause is not a luxury. It's a survival.
Well, I've very, very much so enjoyed our conversation. Well, meeting you for the first time has been a real privilege, and I've learned so much, and I especially feel like I want to go away and learn some more about Rabbi Kook. I did know bits about him, but you've just inspired me to go away and learn a bit more about this great unifying force and this kind of visionary and somebody that was ahead of their time and tried to straddle a middle road, not always successfully, but nevertheless, his endeavor was quite inspiring. So I think that's what I'm going to go away and learn about. And hopefully this is the beginning of many conversations me, you and Eva are going to have. I think we've only scratched the surface on the endless topics that we could discuss. We've chatted about doing a podcast on military Zionism before. So maybe, you'd be interested in chatting to us about Zabotinsky and Trumpeldor sometime as well.
I'll end off with one quote from Rabbi Kook. Rabbi Kook
Please do.
quoted the Talmud. The Talmud says that the second temple was destroyed because there was hatred for no reason. Said the third temple will be built when there is love for no reason.
And on that note, Eva, thank you for coming to this podcast.
Thank you so
as
much.
always.
Okay.
And Rabbi, it's been a real honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.